When you have a complex product, you're going to have an extended supply chain, and bad things could happen anywhere on there. Part of the job is to be more resilient. So when something happens, you can shift and you can do something different. So you're not going to be shut down if one thing goes wrong.
Hi, I'm John Harold, and today we have Chris Caplice, who is the Executive Director of MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here.
So tell us, what is transportation, logistics, and supply chains?
Yeah, so first, CTL is a center we have here at MIT. And what MIT is great about is that you can have centers that are very focused on one area. And so we've been around about 53 years. And when we were first founded, the term supply chain didn't exist. And I'll talk more about that later. But essentially what we do at CTL is we work with companies, whether they're shippers, manufacturers, retailers, distributors, carriers, and we help them solve problems they're facing in their supply chains. And so we've been around, like I said, for over 50 years, work with 100 companies. And what we try and do is take innovation, which we're really good here at MIT, and drive that into practice. So everything we do at CTL is trying to improve the way that things are done today and in the future.
So I guess, how do you study this stuff, right? Because there's so much moving parts. There's a lot of things going on that are happening now, or maybe are only specialized. How do you study transportation, logistics, or supply chains?
Yeah, so supply chain management is one of those weird things, is that no one knew what it was until the pandemic. And then it suddenly, people became aware of it. But it's been around forever, since Alexander the Great. It used to be called logistics. And it's really the physical movement of goods from raw materials to final customer, final use, and the circling back, whether it's recycled, reused, or whatever. But the idea of it is that it has evolved over the years. So if you think of supply chain management today, it's very different from what it was done, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. The term itself wasn't coined until the late 1980s. And that was what happened. Was you had all these different silos going on. You had someone doing transportation, where you move things on trucks or trains or on ships, people managing a warehouse, planning for inventory, doing demand planning. And what's happened over the years, it's kind of gotten consolidated. So what was once done in silos, the big thing that supply chain management is doing is bringing it all together, because the essence of supply chains is there are trade-offs of things. And so if I do something here, it might affect something somewhere else. So supply chain management really is all about how do you get stuff from one original source to final consumption, to final user. And the way we like to think about it is three different arcs, if you will. There's different flows. And so you have the information flow, where you might order something off of online. There's then a physical flow where that thing comes to you. And then there's a financial flow where money goes back and you pay for that thing. So these three flows all kind of constitute the supply chain. And all that we do in supply chain management is manage those three different flows, whether it's the information flow, the physical flow, or the financial flow that reconciles the different engagement.
So since the 80s, there's been a lot of change in technology, a lot of change. What changes are really fundamental that maybe quickly changed the industry since the time you've been studying it?
Yeah, there's so many big things. I graduated college in 1984, so that's when the computers were mini computers, personal computers were just coming out. So you can think of the three big changes, three or four that have come out. One is personal computing. Then you can think of the internet. You can think of mobile computing, hit it again, and now we're seeing AI hit things. So you have these successive waves of technological innovations that ripple through the domain and the practice. So I think the biggest difference is just the ability to communicate. In some of the lectures I give, I talk about the difference in just mobile technology or the data that we can have now. It used to be when I was starting out, and I came to MIT for my PhD in the early 90s, I had my first computer, and it had a massive hard drive of 25 megabytes. And that was awesome. And now you can't even buy 25 megabytes. So one of the big changes we've seen is you have this access to data, and having all this data, availability of data. What we used to have to do is take averages and approximations. And now with so much actual data, you can do much more detailed analysis. You couldn't have AI, generative AI, all of that without the big data that we have. And so that's something that dramatically changed the way that we can do things.
So some things that seem to me haven't changed is like on my experience side or the consumer experience side. In the 80s and stuff, I would go and buy food to make dinner. I would go and buy a personal electronic device, like the Walkmans and the Game Boys.
Sure.
They were all in the 80s. And those things, they feel the same usage now. So moving forward now, what's different that I'm not seeing? But what is different about how I interface with those things that the supply chains has figured out and understood since then?
Well, the big difference is, so yes, you still go out and buy food. You go to the grocery market. Guaranteed the amount of inventory that grocery store holds is much lower because we're much more sophisticated in how we hold things and how much inventory and to move things through. I know you used to go to a store, we used to have a Caldors. I don't even think they're around anymore, where I grew up in Connecticut. And a third of the store was the back room. And that just shrunk because we got much more efficient at bringing things in. So the products might not have changed, although on electronics, they've totally changed, right? They've totally changed. They've been shrunk. And so an iPhone has what would fill this table for different things. But generally, if you're going buying clothes, things like that, the physical thing hasn't changed dramatically, but the way it gets there, the way it's planned, the way it's orchestrated has changed dramatically. I can give you one big example.
Yeah.
And this is just looking at clothes. Over the last 30, 40 years, the cost of clothes have gone down because the globalization, the use of containers, the cost of moving something from Bangladesh to the U.S. dropped dramatically with the introduction and mass adoption of containers. These 40-foot or 20-foot metal boxes make it really easy to move things. And so by lowering the cost, making it more efficient, the cost per unit of bringing product from across the world dropped dramatically. So therefore, lower labor costs we use to make the shirt. So we have many more clothes than we did our parents or grandparents 50 years ago because the cost of those goods went way down because the supply chain is so much more efficient. It enabled globalization.
So does that also mean that the things that maybe were made in one area now can be made in lots of different areas?
Yeah, it depends. Actually sometimes you have no choice. Like I'm going to talk about an example in a second. I can bring it out.
Yeah, sure.
I want to talk about a banana. You can't grow bananas everywhere. Right?
Yeah,
There's
makes
only
sense.
places where you can grow bananas. And you can think about that for other things. I have another prop. A smartphone, an iPhone. You think you could make these in all those places, but in reality, you have ecosystems. You have different areas that have expertise. And so there's been a recent study to say to move and produce an iPhone in the United States would cost, I forget what the exact number was, 5x what it would, because we don't have all that expertise. So sometimes where you source from, you're restricted by natural resources, right? There's only certain places you can get things, or by the expertise of that area. And it's very hard to suddenly move that because you're not just moving that one plant. That plant has a bunch of suppliers, and those suppliers have suppliers. So you have a supplier ecosystem. And that's why it's very hard to move things just quickly from one location to another because you have supporting ecosystem of the different suppliers for that product.
And so, you give these two examples of like an iPhone, which is, this crafted, this made, engineered system. And then you have this banana, which is naturally made and grown.
Comes in its own packaging.
Yeah. Great. And so like when you're looking at these things, are they drastically different in say like manufacturing and agriculture, or are there a lot of overlap? Like when you look at these things, like what can we learn from what you know about these?
Yeah, it's really funny because they're dramatically different, right? There's over 2,500 different components in an iPhone. They come from 40 different countries. 180 different companies are usually involved in this, across 6 continents. And the parts travel over 500,000 miles in all to put this iPhone together. Versus a banana grown in maybe Costa Rica might travel 5,000 miles. And it's like I said, it's in one piece, but there's some very interesting similarities. And the one that I'd like to talk about is perishability. We think of fruit for perishability. This banana is very perishable, right? You can't keep it out too long. But it's something that's controllable. And I'll talk about that in a second. iPhones, though, are in any kind of smartphone, any kind of electronic product is very perishable. You don't want to buy an iPhone 3. Right?
Yeah.
So it's the time frame is different, but perishability is there. And so whenever you have perishability in a product, whether it's a banana, an iPhone, fast fashion goods, pharmaceuticals, if they have a shelf life that makes them perishable, then you have a fundamental question that supply chains try to answer, and that's how much to have for too much versus too little, excess versus shortage cost. And that's known as a news vendor problem. It's a trade-off, and it's a fundamental trade-off that you need to make. How many iPhones should I make? If I make too many, I'm going to have to discount a bunch. If I make too few, I lose demand. And so it's a fundamental question that every sushi restaurant makes every morning, what every newspaper vendor makes in the morning. When do I have, how much should I make? Because I'll always have too much or too little. And depending on the trade-off of those costs, it really dictates what you want to do, what your correct answer is. And that also ties into the idea of demand. Demand is so uncertain. When a new iPhone comes out, they really don't know what the demand's going to be. And especially if you have a new product that's new to industry or new to that company, you have no idea what that's going to be. So when you have uncertain demand, that adds a whole nother complexity to it. And so you've got to figure out, how much do I make? And you're making assumptions on what the demand will materialize. So it's complicated, but it's the same problem that we have for bananas as we have for iPhones. Now, one's much more complicated, but you're making that same fundamental trade-off. How much is the shortage cost? How much is the excess? And what am I willing to make for the trade-off?
And so this demand idea, like it reminds me of the time we notice these supply chains are when things go wrong or things are interrupted, right? They disrupt our lives. So to me, it seems like that's this fragile system, or possibly there's a lot, small effects have big outsized. So can you tell me a little bit more about like, how do you guys prepare for those things, or how do you understand some of these effects?
So the butterfly effect.
Butterfly
right?
effect,
so butterfly flaps its wings in, was it Brazil, and it causes an earthquake somewhere else. So the idea is that any supply chain is pretty extended. Even though our simple banana, that's still traveling 5,000 miles. There's very, very, very few products that don't travel that far. You might have some local, grow local, some vegetables and things like that, but generally products are more complex and they have more extended supply chains. And so whenever you have an extended supply chain, it raises the risks that you just brought up. Something could go wrong. Maybe not with your intermediate sphere that you can control, but might be the supplier of your supplier of your supplier, and where something can happen. And that's the challenge that you have for supply chains. So how do you track, and what's known as a bill of a material, that's all the stuff that goes in. And then you've got different suppliers, and you might call it tier 1, 2, 3, where you deal with tier 1 suppliers, and then your suppliers are tier 2, tier 3, whatever. And the problems usually come in tier 5 or 6, which you have no control over. You might not even know who they are, but something could happen there that then ripples up. And so let me give you an example for the banana. The Strait of Hormuz right now, it's shut down. We're here about the oil, but also other chemicals are having a hard time coming in. And one of those is ethylene. Ethylene is a major component for bananas, believe it or not. What bananas ripen. And so what people will do, they'll use ethylene to slow down that process or speed it up. Because when you walk into a store, you don't want to see just one type of banana. You want to see some really ripe ones you can use right now. You might want to see some that'll be ripe in a day or two, or the real green ones that you want to have for a week from now. To do that, the store controls that, and they have ripening rooms. And so it seems like a very simple product, but the way to get it to you as a consumer, so how you want to consume it in the store or in the airport, it's very complicated, and it uses ethylene. Ethylene predominantly is coming from natural gas. And so there's huge ethylene shortages right now because of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, it's not affecting us in the United States as much for our banana consumption because we have a lot of that production local. But in Southeast Asia, it's causing severe problems. And it's because of nothing you would think of. Also, think about the Strait of Hormuz, it's cutting down on the fertilizer. Most fertilizer production comes from that area. So now that's affecting agriculture. There's all these different stories of something happens here that affects my products, even if they don't touch that, because it's a supplier of a supplier of a supplier. It's an nth tier problem. So I can give you another example.
Please do. Please.
So during the pandemic, everyone ordered hot tubs, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to be at home. You're going to order hot tubs. And so you can look at hot tubs, and they're kind of in between the iPhone and the banana. They probably have 1,000 parts maybe to them. They come from a bunch of different places, but we studied one. And these are hot tubs that are coming in, and they're mainly assembled, I want to say, in Salt Lake City with some products from Georgia. but they also have a chemical coating on the products. You need that. And in February of 2021, there was something called the Texas freeze. And this is where in Texas, the temperature dropped dramatically for extended period of time. And what happened is the natural gas usage went up. It shut down some of the power plants. The power plants shut down, which shut down the chemical plants. The chemical plants in Texas provide the majority of the chemicals used in different materials. And so it shut down a lot of building materials. And for the hot tub example, the coating that you had on the plastic shell of the tub. So because of freezing temperature in Texas, they couldn't, the wait time, the lead time, if you will, for the hot tubs increased to like 4 months because they couldn't get enough. And this whole idea of the Texas freeze, even though the hot tub itself never touched Texas in its productions, it was a supplier. They shut down, and it had ripple effects. And if you're trying to do any kind of building during that time, you felt the impact in the building materials. There were shortages because these chemicals, these coatings go on everything from insulation to even on an iPhone, you have a different coating on there. So when you have a complex product, you're going to have an extended supply chain, and bad things could happen anywhere on there. And part of the job is to be more resilient, to try to have a supply chain that can be more resilient to this. So when something happens, you can shift and you can do something different. So you're not going to be shut down if one thing goes wrong.
Kind of reminds me, you mentioned earlier about how like there aren't that many really truly local supply chains. Maybe some agriculture is, but most things are global. Is that
well, maybe not global, but it's very rare to find any product. If we look at anything in this room, anything you're wearing that didn't travel at least 1,000 miles. It'd be shocking to see if there was something that didn't, except your local farm might have some. But if you go to the grocery store and if it's December and you're eating pears, they're not local, right? They're coming from Chile, right? And so things come everywhere. Yeah, the supply chains are extended. And we do that because it makes it better for the consumer. We have more options. We demand that as a consumer. It's not like companies say, hey, let's make our supply chain long. It's because we want to provide product in the most efficient way. And what's interesting, produce and materials delivered to you in a grocery store is usually more sustainable than something delivered local, because the last mile is the most unsustainable. And so a lot of times you're growing things in a greenhouse up here. Greenhouses take a lot of energy. If something is coming in on a very efficient intermodal train from California, that'll have a lower carbon footprint than the thing grown locally in harsh conditions. So it's it's not intuitive.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, obviously there's balances, right? If you're taking something that you could easily make here, apples or something grow
the
great.
key is easy. If it's easily made in season.
So how do you, in the supply chain, do you guys look at sustainability? Do you guys look at this minimization problem?
No, we don't care about sustainability.
Okay.
Of course we do. Of course we do. No, it's a major thing. And what's challenged for that is it's a cost. There's usually a cost associated with being sustainable. But that there's a trade-off that can be made, and companies are making this every day. At CTL, we have a study group, the Sustainable Supply Chain Lab, and it looks at this for all sorts of things. In fact, some of our early work was looking at bananas and the carbon footprint of bananas, and it really matters where it comes into the U.S. Does it come in through Houston? Does it come in through the Port of Delaware? And that really drives the sustainability, because if you look at the carbon footprint, you can't look at a banana and figure out its carbon footprint. You need to know its history. You need to know what its credence was. Where did it come from and how did it get here? Because that's what drives the sustainability, the carbon footprint for it. So no, sustainability is one of those things that's very critical, even though, the drive for it waxes and wanes. Sometimes it's the number one priority, sometimes it isn't. Interestingly, for like transportation, sustainability and the price of fuel go hand in hand. Because if you're more efficient in your transportation, you're going to be more sustainable, because you put more stuff on the truck, you take fewer miles, that lowers your cost. That also improves your carbon footprint. So there's a lot of similarities between supply chains, sustainability, and their cost. They're being efficient.
And so there's different ways of getting across, traveling across the country. There's trains and there's trucks, and then there's a move for electric. Like, how do you view comparing those two, the comparison between like the trucks, the future of electric travel, and then the trains and where do you think that the best combination of those go?
The answer to any question here
Yeah.
at MIT is it depends, right? It depends on things. But you brought up two different things. So let's talk about it. One is mode choice, because I have a choice of how I bring something in, say from the port of LA coming to Chicago or to the East Coast. It can go by air, which if it came in by boat, it probably won't go by air because air is very expensive. It could go by train, takes longer, very sustainable, very fuel efficient. But like I said, it takes a much longer, or I could send it by truck. Truck is usually the fastest as opposed to air. And so what you're really doing there is making a cost-time trade-off. If the item is more valuable, then time becomes more valuable. If I'm shipping bricks, then I really don't care. I'm going to put it on the slowest train because I look for low cost. So it's really the value of money of the product. So as that product is more expensive, I'm going to pay for speed, because one of the big things that have happened in supply chain over the last 20, 30 years is that the cost of the item is being included in to the cost of the service. So if you look at trucking, I can move things faster, so I don't need as much inventory, safety stock or your buffer stock at the end. If I have a train that takes, 14 days versus a truck that takes 3, then I need 11 days of extra inventory at my destination to cover that. Now, if I'm doing transportation, I will just go to the rail because that's cheaper. But if I'm looking at the whole system, I'll make a trade-off and include the cost of holding that inventory along with the transportation. That's how, when I talked earlier about these silos, when they become connected and when someone cares about all of them, trade-offs are being made. And there's a classic trade-off being made between how much inventory do I hold and how fast should my transportation be? Because fast transportation means I don't need as much inventory, but I'm paying more for transportation. And so then you can do the other trade-off. I might have more inventory buffer and slower transportation, if that makes sense. It's always trade-offs.
And this brings us back to something we talked about earlier about the expense and the carbon footprint of the last mile, right? I mean, last mile, can you define that a little bit and talk about the analysis of that?
Yeah, so for transportation, there's first mile, middle mile, last mile, generally. First mile and last mile generally means you're picking up small things or dropping off small things and doing multiple stops. Middle mile is usually a point-to-point move. You pick up and you drive one. That is the most efficient way to move something. And so if what you have is your last mile, then it's just not as efficient. You have more circuitous miles. It's just not as efficient as that single point-to-point, a streamlined supply chain.
And is there a lot of room for improvement in there on that side?
Sure. There's been a lot of movement on improving the last mile and first mile, especially with the rise of internet e-commerce, where it used to be 20 years ago, last mile meant going to the store. The delivery would be the store and you go to the store. Now stores are being used, especially Walmart is brilliant at this. They're using it as a micro fulfillment center, and they're using that as a little inventory post to deliver to home. So there's been a lot of work in trying to improve last mile delivery, make it more efficient, more intuitive, better planning for that. We have a lab at CTL called the Intelligent Logistics Systems. And what they're doing is a lot of last mile optimization, also looking at drones. How do drones get used with that last mile? Is there a combination they can be used? So it kind of combines those things. But yeah, over the last 30 years, I would say, last mile supply chains have really, really taken off, the analysis of them. But to be honest, it's a very old problem. It's called the traveling salesman problem. It's been around for hundreds of years. It's just, it's funny how everything sits on the shoulders of dead economists. It's the same thing here. The problem's been there for a long time. Now we have better ways of solving it.
And you also have this great opportunity not to just teach people here, but you also teach on the MicroMasters course in MITx. So how do you kind of phrase it? How do you start teaching people about this supply chain?
Actually, the first lecture I do, I actually have a picture, because it's all online, it's all video, of a banana, a smartphone, a carburetor, women's fashion, and I think cement. And I talk about the similarities and differences. And it gets into all those things: perishability, the trade-off of shortage and excess, the trade-off between one we haven't talked about as much, efficiency and resilience. And so you just kind of start with something that everyone knows and then start bringing out the commonalities and the differences. because at the end of the day, the trade-offs are the same. It's just the values are different. So you were making the same trade-offs for all these different products, all these different supply chains. It's just that sometimes the product's so much valuable, you'll shift this way, and other times you'll go the other way. But it's always very nuanced. So I always get frustrated when during the pandemic, people were saying just in time is dead.
Mhm.
It's like, it's not dead. It's just where it fits. Where does it make sense?
And just in time is you're describing how we have much smaller warehouses and like the grocery stores and the better predictions on how much we're going to push out
For
the door.
just in time, it's all about the product, the inventory gets there just in time for manufacturing. So you don't have a lot of extra inventory sitting there. Because whenever you have inventory sitting, bad things happen, right? There's shrinkage, which is code for theft, right? It gets damaged. It gets, if it's perishable, it expires. It gets overripe, whatever. So you don't want to have a lot of inventory just hanging out. And that's the problem. So just in time kind of solved that. You had to have very fast and very coordinated deliveries. So it requires that. Now, when demand surges dramatically, which is what happened during the pandemic, then JIT isn't as appropriate. And so there's a lot of factors that were affecting what happened during the pandemic. But let me tie it into that other trade-off, which we haven't talked as much, that efficiency versus resilience. Because all the trade-offs I was talking about before is all about making it more efficient. Supply chains want to do things, meet the requirements as cheaply as possible. That's what we do. We want to make it as efficient as possible. The problem is, if I have a highly efficient system, it tends to be fragile. Mm-hmm. And if something dramatically changes, my demand spikes, or something breaks down at my third tier supplier, then I've got to react to that. And if I'm highly optimized to have the lowest cost, then I can't respond as much. To be resilient, actually always costs something. It's like an umbrella, right? Do you carry your umbrella around on a sunny day? No, because it's a pain. So you've got to convince someone to carry the umbrella, because no one gets credit for solving a problem that doesn't materialize, right? So if I build in for all this resilience with dual sourcing and this stuff, and nothing bad happens, it looks like I just wasted money. But what you're doing is building in resilience. And the challenge with resilience, it costs something, and the problem might not materialize. Like if I had something set up to where I didn't need to go through the Strait of Hormuz for the last 15 years, am I wasting money? Because everything was fine, more or less. But now it materializes. So resilience is tricky because it only comes, it's only seen as beneficial when something bad happens, and you never know if that's going to happen.
And like the resilience, you mentioned the umbrella. It's like all of a sudden all these umbrellas materialize for sale when it's raining, right? They come out of the stores and you could buy an umbrella anywhere, and then you never see them when they're not raining.
They're in the back room.
Yeah.
And so the question is, you're selling things at a little market. How many umbrellas are you going to stock? Right? That's the challenge. Yeah. That's the supply chain challenge. And that's at every level, you have the exact same one. Demand is uncertain. I can have material, but if I hold that 10 umbrellas and it doesn't rain for 2 months, then, one of them might disappear, one gets broken, whatever, you lose that. And so it's a trade-off. And the trade-off is fundamental to any product, any supply chain.
And so how would we experience this trade-off as the consumer? When we're going through our daily life, we see things or we buy things. How do we experience that? And how do we know, hey, I think that's a trade-off from resilience. I think that's an efficiency trade-off.
Hopefully you don't notice it. The only times when people noticed it was during the pandemic, because we were bombarded on news with these camera shots of empty shelves, right? And usually those were taken around 5 p.m. and the shelves were stocked overnight and they were fine the next morning. But that's the thing. Supply chains are the things that you only hear about when they break. No one says, "Hey, way to go, supply chain! My strawberries are here in March." It's one of these things that's invisible. It works, and the beautiful thing about supply chains, especially during the pandemic, they never stopped working. They always kept working. What the big change was, demand just shifted suddenly. And so, to give you an example of that, if you look at soft drinks, it's sold in restaurants and is a huge component. So you'd have these boxes of syrup that go to restaurants. You've probably seen these before, the machines. And suddenly that channel dropped for at least 6 months. No one could go to restaurants. But the consumption of soda didn't stop. It stayed the same. It just shifted to retail. But in retail, you don't buy boxes of syrup. You buy cans. And so a can of a full truckload of syrup takes about 6 truckloads of cans. to get that same amount of soda. So it's a different supply chain. So suddenly, if the demand shifts, you're going to have some shortages. The supply chain needs to adjust. Not only does it need to get more aluminum, it needs more trucks. So it involves much more effort to get that there. So the supply chain, though, adapts, because one of the things I like to say about a supply chain, it's both a bridge between your suppliers and your final customers, but it's also a shock absorber. So if something happens, your supply chain should react to that. And so you see that it's the first thing that how a company is touched by its suppliers, and it's the last thing that touches it before it goes to its customers. So it is the shock absorber for any external effects.
And I guess that has some implications in consumer behavior as well. I don't know if do you study some of the consumer behavior, because moving from, say, your example of the soda, the syrup, there's also like buying the refills or paying for water or things you can dilute and you can make yourself. Like, does that consumer shift have a big effect on how things go, and how do you integrate
Absolutely.
that?
So that's the challenge. That's the demand problem. So let's say you have something like liquid IV, right? It comes out and it's a powder you put into water. What's the demand for that going to be? When it first comes out, you don't know, right? And so,
And that would be as opposed to buying like Gatorade, right?
yes, yeah,
Like it's fully
do
made,
you buy
just
the
a
mixed,
bottle.
or do you buy it already in the liquid? If I was a supply chain, I would much prefer to be handling the mix rather than in the water, because I'm shipping trucks of water in Gatorade, right? Most of it's liquid. Same thing with, you look at laundry detergent, same thing before they came up with concentrate. And so I would much rather ship packets of this powder. However, you don't know what the consumer behavior is going to be. So the supply chain has to be flexible enough to be able to react depending on what the demand is for that. And that's a beautiful thing about supply chain. Do we design the product? No, but hopefully supply chains are at the table when new products are being introduced, because you can think about a new product being designed with manufacturing in mind to make sure it can be manufactured cheap, but also supply chain in mind. And so there's a lot of examples out there for a lot of toys that were being manufactured in the boxes. Adjusting them just slightly by like an inch means you can put in like 20% more into a container. So if you design with supply chain in mind, that can have ramifications of how much cheaper it can be to deliver it and get it to the final consumer.
It's kind of dawning on me during this conversation that there's so many things out there that would be informed by your work. Like, right? I mean, isn't IKEA or flat pack furniture that's designed for transportation? Before
so much of that, and also it affects how it gets its classification, how customs are paid. It's a complicated system, but yeah. So it's better to ship a table that folds down to a box than a table with the legs that it takes up much more space. So yeah, that's exactly how it's done, and you see that same effect in other areas, like for transmissions getting shipped to a manufacturing, to a assembly plant. You'll see them put into racks, right, that make it so I can just take that transmission and put it right in to the assembly line, and then the racks have to be sent back. But those are used as packaging to help make it more efficient for that transportation.
And this has to do with, I guess, the economics of how things move, right?
Sure.
Because like containers are weights are relevant with containers. Is that right?
No, weight.
No, that's wrong.
Weight. So anytime you have a trailer, a box, a pallet, a container, whatever it is, you have different capacities, and there's always a weight capacity. There's always a cube capacity, the volume, and sometimes there's a value capacity. You will never see a full truckload, which can handle like 40,000 pounds, full of razor blades, because that would be hijacked before it got out of the parking lot, right? Because it's so high value. So you might have, I only want, I don't know, $150,000 worth of product in my truck, right? You're not going to ship a full truckload of iPads. And so, but cubing out and weighing out, that's what's really interesting, because if you're like Frito-Lay and I'm just shipping potato chips, I'm going to cube out. But if you had a mix and
cube out's like volume, maximize the volume.
It out, you cube out. Yeah, you fit in, but it's going to be way light. So you can think of a two-dimensional axis here where you have the weight and the volume, and what you really want to do is maximize both. And it's hard, but you might mix products. So what Gillette used to do, and P&G, which owns Gillette now, they would mix their products in the truck such that they get as close to cubing and weighing out as possible, because that increases the amount that you can put in the truck. And so, yeah, it's much more complicated. There's all sorts of different thoughts about how you can load trucks and unload, and that's actually the last stage of automation where they can have robots. There's robotics in warehouses now that do the put away, that can move things around, very, very well established. But to actually load the truck is much more complicated. That single person, they still have people doing that. They're finally getting to do that. And so it's one of those things that seems mundane, but is actually quite complicated. That's like the hallmark of supply chain. It seems so simple, but as you dive a little deeper into it, it gets complicated because what you do in this stage of a supply chain affects this, can affect this, can affect this. Nothing is isolated. So you have to have a larger, holistic, end-to-end perspective.
Yeah, it seems like in any direction you look at supply chain, there's this complicated optimization problem to kind of solve.
And that's another aspect that I love about supply chain. It's very analytical. There's a lot of high-end math that's being done, but also it's very human because people are involved at every aspect of it. So you tie together both the managerial side of things plus the heavy analytical side. And to be a very good supply chain professional, you need to have a foot in both to be able to handle that. Plus, there's that third aspect. There's physical movement of things. So you got the physical movement, and that has a whole new dimension. It's not like you're just doing marketing and you launch a campaign. You're actually physically moving product around.
Can you think of maybe some examples of when the supply chain side maybe broke down and there was massive losses, maybe not on empty shelves, but on the other side where there are things that maybe, perishable items or something that went bad, and like where those mishaps kind of happened?
Yeah. So anytime, some of the examples I gave before about that Texas freeze, that's where the supply chain has to come in and adjust. So there are a lot of cases where, due to weather, due to maybe a factory closing. Look at what COVID did. It did two things. One is demand skyrocketed because we suddenly got all this money. We're sitting at home, want to spend it. But then manufacturing got scattered, right? You couldn't manufacture things because if you remember back, it's only been 5 years. There were rolling shutdowns. Like, okay, you can't open this plant today because there's a COVID outbreak. So your production was unstable. So in that aspect, supply chains have to come in and you get much more judicious in where you bring product from and send it to. That's why there was a lot of allocation of goods going in because you couldn't meet all of the demand. But generally, this is what supply chains are good at. So give an example of something from last year when Liberation Day, right, when all the tariffs were going to hit and it got announced for all the tariffs. A bunch of supply chain professionals around, and they, we're asking what's going on. They said, yeah, it's another Tuesday, because the idea of supply chains, they're that shock absorber, and they're used to dealing with these crises. And so over the last 10 years, you don't even call them black swan events anymore. Something is going to happen because with an extended supply chain, something bad is going to happen somewhere. You don't know exactly where, when, or what, but you can actually boil it down and try to understand what the effect of that is going to be. And so this gets me to another thing that we do at CTL, which is called scenario planning, where you don't try to predict what the future is going to be, because we're very bad. Humans are very bad at predicting the future. There's tons of examples of how bad our predictions can be, but we're really good at preparing. And so what scenario planning does, it says envision a future. And if the future looks like this, how would you react? If the future looked like this over here, how would you react differently? And so instead of trying to box and predict the future, you're playing judo and you're reacting to it. And the benefit of doing that for a company is the company gets exercises the muscle that helps them determine if something's different, how do I react? They get more responsive. So we have an example where a trucking company in the fall of 2019, did some training to understand what would happen in a workplace violence incident. And so they brought their senior management together. They talked about it, what would do. You'd have an emergency room. You'd get communication set up, all these different things. Then, of course, 6 months later, COVID happened. And what they found is the exact same thing had to happen, right? Totally different event, but the effect on the company was the same. You had to have central control. You had to get communication and be able to shut things down and move things around. So the idea is you don't need to prepare your company for every different event that might happen, because it could be a factory closure, weather, strike, You can think of a million things, but the effect is you might not have availability. And so by training on one thing, it makes you better at all these other things. It's like calisthenics, right? If you do sit-ups, it makes you better at other things as well. So this idea of scenario planning and being comfortable with you knowing something's going to happen and making sure your company is agile enough and has the resiliency to react to that, because you don't know what exactly is going to happen, but you want to be resilient enough for it. And that trade-off I talked before about efficiency and resilience, I think it's funny. I was just talking with someone that during the pandemic, we became very comfortable being resilient. You wanted to pay extra for that. You wanted to be flexible. But we forget. There's some corporate forgetting going on 2-3 years. And so whenever this new crisis happens, we remember again, like the Strait of Hormuz. Just remember, oh, maybe we need to be resilient. So it's something that's constantly there, but we need to constantly remind ourselves, because the natural drive is to be more efficient. If left alone, supply chains will be the most efficient possible until something bad happens. Then we'll back up again and try and find the most efficient way under the new conditions.
And hopefully our experience as consumers doesn't notice that.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Well, consumers like you have gotten much more picky. I mean, it used to be you'd wait a week, and then it was 2 days, then it's 1 day. Now it's 3 hours. So we're our own enemy, right? We're driving this. So you talk about, fast delivery is not the most sustainable, right? Getting something next day or within an hour is going to lead to the least sustainably supportive transportation mode, because you're going to be driving one thing to you and then going back empty. But we want that. And so the sustainability challenges, really, a lot of it comes from consumers.
Well, you made a good point earlier saying that humans are terrible at predicting.
We are.
So I'm going to put you on the spot now. So I'd love you to predict some of the future challenges, some of the unsolved mysteries, things that supply chain study is going to be working on in the future and maybe hopefully solving soon.
I think the two big things that are coming down right now, and they're not really problems, but they're new solutions, and we're trying to figure them out, is electrification and that whole energy grid, but also AV, robotics. And we're seeing this more. So, and they're not unrelated. So on the electrical grid, we're seeing more of that last mile delivery that I talked about being delivered by electric vehicles. It makes more sense. They fit a cycle. They can get charged at night. They don't have huge, long lengths of haul. So it kind of makes sense. The challenge is the electric grid can't support it. The transition to all EVs for freight or for passenger cars, the current grid as it stands cannot handle it. So there's a lot of work going on. How can I improve my grid? And so a lot of work here at MIT in MIghty is looking at this. And that'll have huge implications for what companies can do and use EVs within their network. The other is autonomous vehicles, which has been coming, 1 year out for the last 20 years. But it's actually happening now. In Texas, there's more actual movement of autonomous trucks, and you're going to see more of that. It won't come all the way out. You won't be seeing it in Boston anytime soon. But you're going to see it in the Southeast. California just approved recently, I think 2 days ago, that you can have heavy-duty vehicles that are autonomous without a safety driver in it. So it's happening in different states. It's not all red states, it's blue states too. It's really a combination of the regulatory environment, the topology, and the environment as far as the climate. So we're seeing more of that too. So those are two big things that I see. And then, of course, AI. AI is affecting everything. We're finding agentic AI, where the AI does more than just return information. It actually connects outside the system, whether it's to the web, to another system. That's having more implications, but it's really early days. There's a lot of pilots going on, and with all new introduction of any technology, a lot of failures. But we're seeing that it's changing the way that some work is done. And like any new technology, it's going to displace some jobs, create some new jobs. And so we're still sorting that out.
And I have one more question for you. Is there any common misconceptions about supply chains or logistics that you'd love to kind of clear up right now? We have the mic.
Well, I think the big misconception, everyone thinks stuff just appears. It's just right there. And we don't think about it. Like I said, during the pandemic, suddenly when my banana wasn't there at 5 p.m. when I left work and wanted to come, you suddenly realized that, oh my gosh, there's more to it than that. So I think the biggest misconception is that people don't even think about it. It's that invisible thing. And it's kind of like electricity. We don't think about it. 100 years ago, this was crazy to have this, and now we can't live without it. Internet, it's invisible. It's like the air we breathe, right? And so I think the biggest misconception is that people don't even think about supply chains because they work so well and they've done such a good job over the last many years that we just take it for granted. That's the big misconception.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming and talking with me. If anyone wants to learn more, you can go to learn.mit.edu, and you have some of your stuff on there too. You can see some of your...
They can take a MicroMasters course in supply chain management and learn all about this and all the math and all the different methods.
That'd be great. Okay, thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, John.